This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, never dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Adam Ruben to the show today. Adam, you're a writer, comedian, storyteller, and molecular biologist. I've found that individuals typically have a highly developed professional grade skill set in one of these areas. It's either communication or STEM, for example, but usually not both in one brain. I should say that both these skill sets can be learned and sharpened, of course. I'm wondering, though, did you develop both in tandem? Was there an element from your environment growing up maybe that fostered these dual talents? Just love to know how you got and set about work on both of these tracks.
Sure. Yeah. I've always been interested in both, in science without writing and in writing without science. And so overlapping them is actually kind of something that I resisted for a while because it felt like cheating. It felt like if I'm supposed to succeed in something, it's supposed to be in one without the other. I would take creative writing classes in college and everybody else would be an English major and I'd be the one molecular biology major. And so I thought, if I shouldn't be writing about science, I should be trying to succeed as a writer without being a science writer. And at some point I realized that's really not a great idea. If you like science and you like communication, you're part of a pretty small club that enjoys both. And so it's a niche that you can fill that a lot of people can't fill. And so to ignore that niche I learned at some point that was a mistake.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. And as you referenced, it is a small club. And I wonder if you think all scientists should be able to clearly and crisply communicate their work to general audiences without dumbing it down.
Communication is incredibly important for scientists, and it's something that not all science programs prioritize. I mean, think of all the classes you're obligated to take in a science master's degree or Ph.D. or even undergraduate. There's not a whole lot of communication in there typically, and yet it's so incredibly important. A lot of science research gets buried, gets ignored, gets non-funded just because the person conducting the research doesn't know how to communicate about it effectively or doesn't care to communicate about it effectively because they feel that the science should speak for itself. And maybe the science should speak for itself, but it doesn't. And it really needs a person who can communicate about it to others to get them interested. And that's whether you're applying for a grant or speaking to the media or speaking to the public or even just recruiting new graduate students to join your lab. You tend to be a lot more successful if you can speak about science in a way that's effective and interesting and easy to understand. And I think a lot of scientists are aware of how low the bar is for communication skills in science. And anyone who sat through a scientific seminar knows that maybe 95% of the time you're going to be lost by slide 2. And no one talks about it while they're sitting in the audience. They're not looking at each other saying, I don't get this, do you? No, they're all sitting there nodding their heads because no one wants to be seen as the one person who doesn't get it. But in reality, one of those talks that's alphabet soup, or I'm going to show you an acronym on slide 1. Never going to tell you what it is again because I already showed it to you. That makes sense if people are math, but we're not. So you have to really think about how the audience is thinking. Think about what they're perceiving, what they're forgetting, hold their hands, walk them through. I was invited to speak at a conference once by a high school student. This high school student had put together this scientific conference on the weekend, invited a few people to speak, and it was an interesting idea. And when we got there, we looked out and noticed that for whatever reason, most of the audience was middle school students. We had no idea that was going to be the case. And so everyone suddenly started, I don't want to say dumbing down the presentations, but speaking in a way that would be clear to middle school students. And it is the best conference I've ever been to. I understood and was interested by every person's presentation. They've got the same graphs, the same data, but they all had to stop and think about what's that sixth grader in the first row? What's going to make them not fall asleep? And so the result for me as another scientist watching was, this was great. I see your dog is digging into your chair behind you there.
Yeah, it's something she does all the time. And I would say her name, but then she would want to come over here. She's getting comfortable. I love that story. Really, it's so vivid. And I want to ask you now, because you've had this experience, you're in this English class in college as the only scientist, and you're recognizing that your two passions that you've had since you were a little kid, science and communication and English and writing, don't have to be separate. And you're listening to this presentation now, describing just a moment ago, that was so engaging, and it was just meant for a general audience, younger audience. And I'm wondering now, as a scientist, in your current work, but also previously during other chapters of your academic and professional life, if you ever felt criticized or penalized even for being such an active and exceptional communicator. I just think about the story regarding Carl Sagan saying he was denied tenure at Harvard because he did this outreach, and his ability to popularize the work that he was doing was somehow viewed as not serious, and therefore he wasn't worthy of tenure according to what they were saying. But I'm wondering if you've ever had an experience where you felt like the communication aspect was denigrated, or people just didn't view it as serious or an important part of doing science, the ability to communicate about it.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of scientists who view communication as frivolous. It's something for the English majors to do, not something that we need to do. I had my graduate school advisor one day pulled me into his office, and he held up the campus newspaper. So the campus newspaper had just done a little story about me, about the grad student who does comedy on the weekends. And he held it up and he asked me to come in, and he said, "This is an embarrassment to the department." And I'm like, because I have a hobby? Why is that? Why is that? And he said, "It shows that your mind is not on science, it's on stand-up comedy." And he said, multiple professors have come to him with this article, telling him that it's an embarrassment to the department. He agreed. And meanwhile, I don't know what I said. I think I just decided at that point, either I can keep embarrassing the department, or I can stop doing the things I do outside the lab, or I can just keep quiet about the things I do outside the lab. And that's the option I chose. But thinking back on it, what I should have said to him is, wait a minute, this other grad student is spending her free time running marathons. And this one is a DJ at a club downtown. And this one volunteers at an art museum. And this one has 2 kids. You're not going to tell one of them, because you have 2 kids and you're really out there about having these 2 kids, you're not a serious scientist. No, but for some reason, communication, comedy was a much more active threat than anything else that could be consuming your time outside the lab. And I remember even after grad school, in my industry job where I worked for almost 11 years, I was at my annual review with the CEO once, and he said something like, "And recognizing that you have another career outside of here." And I said, "More a hobby than a career." And he got this smile on his face. He said, "Oh, that's the first time I've heard you say it," as though it was great that I was calling it a hobby instead of a career, because thank goodness he didn't have this scientist who was doing these other communication things outside the lab. And so I have certainly seen that sort of thing. I feel for Carl Sagan. One more example, this is a little thing, but I wrote a grant application once for my advisor in grad school, and he brought it to me right away. And he said, "This word is not a science word. It's a word from poetry." And the word was lone, L-O-N-E, because I'd used the word only 5 times and wanted to send it. It wasn't like pontificating on the lone. It was all just plasmepsin 2 is the lone plasmepsin in the food vacuole of the malaria parasite, which does blah, blah, blah. Is all it was, single word. But he picked out that word as, that's not science, that's not technical, must stay technical. And so for even something as tiny as that to be an excursion from what a scientist wants you to do, I learned at some point that there are a lot of scientists who don't think communication is something that scientists ought to prioritize.
I have to ask you to follow up, because you have such rich and diverse experience, different sectors, and within industry, within academia, and so forth. Why do you think there is that feeling of disdain, or I guess I would say maybe insecurity, maybe even part of it is feeling threatened, maybe, got into science so you wouldn't have to write a paper. I sometimes have empathy when I'm working with groups who are scientists and say, look, I was you in reverse, avoided science and math after high school. And maybe you were thinking you'd be able to avoid writing and communication after high school. And now
Yeah.
here I am telling you need to be a better communicator. And here you are demonstrating that you can do both. Maybe that is threatening.
Maybe I don't want to come across as saying, what I do threatens people, but I think it's more like, and I'm sure this is not just in science, a lot of scientists and probably people in every industry are insecure. And not saying that I'm not, but I think a lot of people are insecure that someone's going to see them as less serious than they are. Which is why even today, for example, if I were a tenure track professor and my whole goal in the next 5-6 years is to get tenure, and that's what I need to do to move on with my life and get to where I want to be. And someone came to me and said, hey, we'd like you to do this cool communications thing that has nothing to do with real science. Like just making up an example. Let's say someone said, we'd like to put together a cartoon about your research. Do you want to write that cartoon? And we can put it together for kids. A part of me would be, this sounds amazing, but don't spend too much time on this, and don't let the real scientists know that you're spending too much time on this. Make sure you always characterize it as a strange hobby you do outside for fun, because otherwise they're going to, every time your results are less than stellar, they're going to come to you and say, if you'd spent a little more time in the lab than you did on this cartoon, maybe you'd have good results. And so I can't speak to why those from above would come down against communication, but I can certainly speak to why those from below are insecure about highlighting their ability to communicate. We're made to feel like we're scientists if we're not spending that on strict, straight science. And so there's a lot of insecurity there.
I want to ask you too, because you've been in both science and communication and comedy for a long time, whether you think there has been maybe evolution is putting a thumb on the scale, or maybe asking it in a more neutral way, which is, how has the field of science communication or attitudes towards science communication changed since you first entered it more than 15 years ago?
I think a lot more people are coming to understand the importance of science communication. I've spoken at a lot of universities and conferences that are just now adding these science communication sessions. There are great things like the 3-minute thesis competition, which was started at a university in Australia and now is at 400 plus universities, where people distill their thesis into 3 minutes and present it. And that's a communication challenge. And there are contests and winners and things like that just to make it more fun. But there's other similar things all over the place. I just judged something a few months ago at Johns Hopkins that was more like a TED Talk for theses, and science and not science. There's the Dance Your Ph.D. program from AAAS, where people turn their PhD into an interpretive dance. And that's also what I mean about feeling insecure. If that was around when I was a PhD student, I would have probably done it and had a blast doing it, and also would have felt that I can't let my advisor know that I'm taking much time to do it. And as long as there's this pressure from above not to be communicators, not to broaden yourself and be well-rounded outside the lab, there's going to be this reluctance from below. So what has been changing recently is more and more of these programs are out there. I've done training sessions, storytelling for scientists, things like that, conferences that have sessions where scientists can work on communication skills, science storytelling groups like Story Collider that are out there and worldwide. These things have grown in the past 15, 20 years, and it's been great.
Yes, absolutely. We've been talking a lot about communication generally, but I want to zero in on one of your specialties, of course, which is stand-up comedy, and ask you the obvious question: why, of all the communication aspects, why stand-up comedy?
I don't know. I started doing stand-up comedy just for fun. The very first time I did it, I saw a flyer in college that said there's a stand-up contest in the cafeteria one night, and I thought it might be fun to try it. It turned out to be a lot of fun. So I did the same contest every year for the next 4 years. And then after I got out of college, I thought, could I try this in the real world? In the real world, where it was a lot less fun, because in college, you're performing in front of 100 students who are all very similar to you and laugh at the same things you do. And half of the people in the audience are your friends because you've asked them to come. And so it's so simple. Then you go out to the real world and you go to an open mic night on a Thursday at midnight in downtown Baltimore, where you've got 30 comedians and 5 audience members. and you're 2.5 hours deep into this thing and everyone's asleep and you're like, why am I here? Is this what this career is? But I stuck with it, and I've had so many bad gigs. I once did a one-man show all about bad gigs like that. There are plenty of them, but it's been a lot of fun to do. And then if you're a science comedian, that's an even smaller niche. It allows you to perform in places where there's a pretty small list of people to pull from. There are science comedians in the world, but there probably aren't hundreds. So that helps. And it's just something that's been a lot of fun.
Getting to that point about there are not many who are focused on science is comedy. Well, many of the topics in science these days, and we're talking in August of 2022, climate change, pandemics, so forth. It's hard to find humor in these things, right? Not that you have to necessarily talk about these topics, because you can pull from a lot of different ones, but how do you wring comedic juice, if you will, from some serious topics?
It's all about finding shared thoughts. A lot of comedy is finding out what's interesting or funny or hypocritical or bizarre about something that we all know, but no one really says. And so that can be true for any topic, for climate change, pandemics, but also just about science itself. I talk about science fairs on stage and the projects that we did when we were in 4th grade and stuff like that. It doesn't always have to be the weighty topics in science. It can really be the more frivolous, fun things that everybody can relate to because they all did them growing up.
Adam, you've of course written 2 books, Pinball Wizards and Stupid Decision to Go to Grad School. So of course, we're going to have links to this in the show notes so listeners can learn more about those books and purchase them if they'd like. I want to ask you what led you to write each book and what maybe are the major themes you'd like readers to take away from each.
Sure. So the 2 books are very different from each other. The grad school book I pitched while I was in grad school. It's a weird situation. A friend of mine from college had gone to work for National Lampoon, the folks who make the movies, but also they had a college TV network. And then through him, I was able to write a few humor articles for their website, which are not very good. I don't even know if they're up anymore, and I hope not, because they weren't very good. But at some point, they emailed all the writers and said, we'd like you guys to pitch book ideas. Some humor book about a topic I'm a lot about. I thought, I'm in grad school. There are all these satirical guides to college, how to build a bong out of beer bottles in your dorm room, but there's none for grad school. So I pitched that, and Lampoon said, thanks, but this is not our target demographic. Our target demographic is drunk frat guys. They don't go to grad school. But then the person who had been in charge of reading all the book pitches ended up leaving National Lampoon and then emailed everybody and said, well, I don't work there anymore, but a lot of you had pitches that were interesting that they didn't want. So if you pay me, I will give you a list of literary agents who take humor books you can send your pitch to. And I sat on that decision for 2 years because it didn't seem, should I be paying for this? Is this a scam? I don't even know. Is anyone going to like this book? Anyway, I eventually paid for the list, emailed a lot of agents in one fell swoop. Many of the agents' email addresses bounced back. Others never responded. Others responded and said no thanks. But all I needed was one. I got one agent who was interested, and she's very good. And she pitched it to publishers. And from what I remember, because this was a little while ago, every publisher basically, you can't sell a book to a demographic that is by definition poor. And so they said a book for grad students, we're not interested in whether this book should exist. We're interested in whether people will buy the book, and they don't have money. No, but we found one publisher that was interested, Random House, and that was great. So that's how that book came about. It was published in April of 2010. It's interesting. I was thinking over the years that, boy, some of those jokes in it about the financial crisis aren't really timely anymore, except now they are again. So good.
Or time for a second edition.
Exactly. But those are the parts that I'll leave intact. So that was that book. And then the other book, Pinball Wizards, very different book. It's a narrative nonfiction book about the past, present, and future of pinball. Nothing to do with grad school, nothing to do with science. It's just, I also really like pinball. And so for years, I've been competing at pinball competitions and going to Pinball League and some Pinball Expo. I'm in various pinball Facebook groups. If anyone wants to talk about pinball, I will talk to them about pinball for quite a while. And then when my daughter was born, I couldn't really spend a night out every week going to Pinball League. And at some point, my wife said, you keep talking about writing a pinball book. If you pitch it and someone wants it and you end up having to write it, you will have to go research it. And that would be okay. So that was my motivation. I remember I sent my pitch to my agent and it was 80 pages long. And she basically said, I don't think this is going to be very commercially successful, but it seems to be important to you. Maybe we can find a small publisher. And a small publisher is what we found, but a great publisher, Chicago Review Press. And I don't care if the book didn't sell well because I had a lot of fun traveling to write it. I got to go to pinball factories and go back to competitions, interview some of the people that designed the games that I loved growing up. I got to meet them and talk to them. Now, these are people who, when they walk down the street, no one knows who they are. But when they go to a pinball convention, everyone is, oh my God, that was Roger Sharp. That was Pat Lawler. Is that really Pat Lawler down? That's Steve Ritchie. And to me, I'm like, oh my God, it's these guys. And eventually I wrote the book, and actually I showed it to my wife before sending in the final draft. And I said, okay, this is my check on whether I'm just geeking out too much or if it's interesting to people who don't know much about pinball. And she took out her red pen and then got it back to me, and 20,000 words fell out. So you just like give a footnote that's 2 paragraphs long about this one metal peg at the side of the outlane and its importance and its use. No one gives a crap. Take that out. So that's what that book is. That book came out in 2017, and that had been a lot of fun. I've gotten to go with the grad school book. The best part of it was after the book came out, I started getting invited to do a book reading and signing and performance and talks and keynotes and things like that at grad schools. And then same with the pinball book, I was going to pinball arcades and pinball events and conferences and things like that, a retro gaming convention, and just giving a talk about pinballs. That's been really fun too. And I had gone to, I think, 33 states and 6 countries doing all this stuff when the pandemic hit. And now I have not gone anywhere. I've now spoken at all kinds of really interesting places from this chair in this basement. We're inviting you to give a talk in New Mexico. Would you like to speak in Switzerland, but on Zoom? Okay. And so hoping in a few weeks, I'm supposed to travel to Tampa for a talk at the Moffitt Cancer Center. That'll be my first time traveling anywhere since COVID hit. And so I'm really hoping, it's already been canceled twice. I'm hoping it'll not be canceled yet.
What's the topic going to be on this one?
I do a lot of talks about alternative science careers because that's something else that has grown in recent years. Mm-hmm. People have realized that you can't just train scientists to be academics and then assume that they're all going to get tenure track jobs and be happy. A lot of scientists reach the end of a postdoc, get to age 40, and then realize there aren't tenure track jobs. And the problem is that as scientists are being trained, they're not always told about all the other jobs you can do with the PhD. And when they are, they're called alternative careers with alternative in big letters, as if it's some kind of consolation prize. Now, you could be a science communicator if you can't cut it in the lab. But in reality, being a science communicator or a science educator or going into science venture capital or editing a trade journal or working at a science museum, or so many things. In one of the talks that I give, I list 35 different careers that require a science PhD that have nothing to do with being in academia, and where the PhD is not just something incidental that you happen to have, but it's something that's crucial to your career. That's a talk I've been giving a lot of places lately because it's needed.
Yeah, I just had this funny sort of combination of the two things that you're an expert in, the comedy and the science. It'd be like a Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire, but all the things would be alternative science careers.
Maybe I'll write that.
I want to ask as you wrap up, Adam, this has been wonderful and really insightful. I know listeners are going to get a lot of value from hearing you talking about these various topics. I think as we wrap, I'd like to ask you about the best advice that you ever got about delivering your science to non-scientists.
Think like your audience. And that's true, again, like I said at the beginning of this interview, whether you're speaking to one person because you want to explain your research to your grandmother, or you're speaking to an entire audience at an international conference. Think about what they're thinking about. Always be in their head because they're the ones you're trying to communicate to. If you think your audience is getting bored, why do you think they're getting bored? Did you stumble over and gloss over some definition that they really need to understand the next 5 slides? If that's the case, go back and make sure that they understand it before you continue those 5 slides. Otherwise, those 5 slides are pointless. So always be thinking about what they're thinking about. Control the talk. Don't let the talk control you. I've seen people be 100% beholden to a pre-written talk on a piece of paper. And if you're going to do that, you're not really adding any value. You're just being at a microphone. The value that you should be adding as the person standing up there and giving your talk is that you are the one that it's all expressed through. You can have emotions. You can be thrilled about results. You can be disappointed about results. You can be surprised by something and that caused something else to happen. Everything is a story, and people are hardwired to be interested in stories. When I teach classes, I'll sometimes tell the first couple sentences of a story, then just point out to the students, you see what happened during those sentences. Like on the way here today, I was driving and I saw this guy walking next to the road in a dragon costume. And I looked over and he had something in his hand. You know what he had? And then, no, this is not a real story. I just made that up. But weren't you really fascinated? That's what a wonderful, beautiful, useful cheat stories are, because you can't hear the first sentence of a story and not want to keep hearing it. And science is a story too. Even if you're just giving graphs and results, it doesn't have to be some kind of non-scientific digression into wasting time about when I woke up this morning and looked at these results. You don't have to do it like that, but it's still a story. Even if it's just, we are interested in this question. And so that caused us to ask this question. We got this answer, and here's what it means, and here's why it's important. That's a story too. Incorporate the skills you have as a storyteller into your science, because we all have hidden storytelling skills that we somehow forget about when science becomes the topic. And just think about sitting around the lunch table with your friends and something crazy happened to you that morning, and think about the way that you're going to talk to your friends. You have that ability. You're not going to present that story like a scientific presentation. You're going to come in and tell people about this crazy thing that happened to you. And so you've got that ability. Put it into science also.
Adam, thanks for just so concisely and powerfully explaining that and making it so vivid for all of us and everyone listening
Thank you.
at home. Thanks for being on the show. Listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.